I live in an era of history when we're burdened with the common misconception that civil disobedience is the emblem of democracy. People commonly say civil disobedience is the essence of democracy. And this is an error. The thesis of this video, which you're watching right now, is that instead civil disobedience is the opposite of democracy. Don't believe me? What do you think was the single most successful, single most influential example of civil disobedience during your lifetime? It's a lot easier to sympathize with civil disobedience in the context of a modern Western democratic country. It's a lot easier to sympathize when it ends in failure, when the leaders of the movement are tragic, heroic, snuffed out. But is it really a positive thing to live in a society where 65% of people can vote for a law, and then a small minority, maybe 5%, opposing that law through civil disobedience can completely subvert the course of democracy? Would it be a good thing if just 5% of the population in your country were fundamentalist religious Catholics who opposed birth control? Just 5% of people believe in that really passionately. And let's say 65% of people voted in a referendum to say, you know what, birth control should be legal, it should be widely available. Let's even say it should be freely available. Let's say it's available for free in this country you're living in. Okay, so there was a vote on this. There was a referendum to make birth control free and available to everyone. But just 5% of your population engaging in civil disobedience brought that down. You would be, within your rights, say, wait a minute. All of us participated in this democratic process, and we didn't just vote. There's some kind of procedure leading up to the vote. People made speeches, people wrote articles. We engaged in this process. Maybe not as equals, maybe it's not perfectly transparent, maybe it's not perfectly fair, but nevertheless, with all its imperfections, we participated in this process. And 65% of us decided that this was in our interest to make birth control available to everyone. And the 65%, we didn't just decide that it was in our best interest. We decided that this was in the best interest of 100%. We made this decision for all of us. We made this to benefit you also, because even though you disagree with us, we decided that we're right and you're wrong. So we're doing this for you too. And now here you are. You have just 5% of the population, but you're well organized, you're religious fanatics. Let's say you got a little bit of money, this 5% of the population, they've got donations coming in. And through civil disobedience, you're shutting down the airport. You're making it impossible for airplanes to take off. And now this minority of the population is holding the whole society hostage through civil disobedience. It's demanding that the majority concede to the minority, that they don't rule in their own self-interest or in the interest of 100%, but that in effect, this 5% of the population, whatever it may be. I don't think you would sympathize if we were talking about anti-abortion, pro-life protesters. Again, maybe 5% of the population overturning the decision of the majority about abortion. I don't think you would sympathize if we were talking about anti-vaxxers, who may or may not be 5% of the population. People who are morally opposed to the use of vaccine, quite possibly because they're religious fanatics, quite possibly for other reasons, if they hold all society. What we're actually interested in here are two things. One is the difference between right and wrong. Okay? It's possible 51% of the population will be wrong. It's entirely possible. Okay? And that's why point two is we're interested in who. Who gets to be right? Who gets wrong? Who gets to make that mistake? Who gets to learn from those mistakes? In a dictatorship, it may be just one person is the person who gets to be right and wrong. But no, I'm actually very fundamentally opposed to the model of a society being ruled and being led through civil disobedience of tiny minorities acting in their own self-interest or in their perceived self-interest. What I'm interested in is the whole of society, or the majority of society, being engaged in discussions and debates and then coming to a conclusion and voting And then all of us having to deal with the consequences of that vote, of that law being passed, of that policy being embraced. Let's come back to my question I asked you earlier. I'm going to tell you the single most decisive and important example of civil disobedience during my lifetime. It was in the disputed election of the year 2000, the election of George W. Bush against Al Gore. Some of you might be old enough to remember this. There was a formal recounting process ordered. If that recounting process had gone ahead, as a matter of fact, Al Gore would have become the next president of the United States of America. The recount was legally ordered and it began to be carried out. They had offices, they had a small office building, and they had a few security guards, but they didn't have the army there. They didn't have a whole police force or anything. And an act of civil disobedience halted, interrupted, and prevented from continuing this recount of the ballots. Now, this act of civil disobedience, it looked like there were only 30 people involved. Maybe there were 200 people. Maybe there were 200 protesters. I remember the actual videotape that appeared on the news. It looked like only a few dozen people were there participating in this protest, in this act of civil disobedience. And I remember a political scientist who went through the picture of the protesters and identified a whole bunch of who they were, what their connections were to the Republican Party, and this kind of thing. So it was not a huge mob of people. Now, even if it was, even if 5% of the population, which would be a huge, huge number of people, converged on this spot and physically prevented the counting of the ballots, that would be the wrong thing to do, because it's not about 5% of the population, and it's not about 50 people or 200 people. It's about everyone. It's about all of us. It's about democracy being as inclusive as possible, or at least including everyone who wants to participate. Okay, so through this act of civil disobedience, a very small number of people, in peculiar circumstances, completely transformed the course of world history. It's not an exaggeration. The whole world would be different today if during that period of 8 years, or even just that period of 4 years, Al Gore had been president of the United States instead of George W. Bush. That period of time didn't just have dramatic impacts on the United States of America, had unbelievable impacts on the history of the whole world. And yes, the civil disobedience of these few people, the consequences were magnified by unique historical circumstances. The consequences were very much magnified by a ridiculous decision made by the U.S. Supreme Court, a decision I did actually read. But you know what? All of political history transpires in unique circumstances. All right, decisions and events, their consequences are magnified by peculiar historical circumstances beyond our control all the time. Okay? That's not what I believe in. I don't believe in a tiny minority of people, a few hundred, a few thousand, or even 5% of the population, perverting the course of democracy. And I know the excuses people are going to jump up to me. Well, they claim, democracy is already perverted. Yeah? Fix it. You think Congress is broken? Fix it. I mean, don't make that an excuse, in my opinion, for something that is fundamentally undemocratic and frankly anti-democratic as the cure for what's wrong with your particular form of democracy in your particular country. Why is it that the romanticization of civil disobedience enters into our political discourse so late in the history of Western civilization? Why is it that, if you even just think about the nouns and verbs we use in politics, almost the entire lexicon can be found in Aristotle, right? Democracy, aristocracy, oligarchy, the whole vocabulary, and really, even the majority of what you find in Karl Marx, the idea of class interest and self-interest, how democracy works and doesn't work, we kind of get all the machinery of political science handed to us by this one author, Aristotle, in ancient Greece. And that's because he's gathering together the work of many different people from several generations who observed, frankly, the rise and fall of democracy. They observed both the advantages and disadvantages of democracy in Athens throughout the ancient Greek world. Why is it that when we read Aristotle, we don't find this concept of civil disobedience? I'll tell you why. It's because it's obviously dishonorable and evil in a society that truly has direct democracy for someone to try to subvert that democracy through civil disobedience. Right? So take the example of Athens starting its war with Sparta. So this is the war that's documented by Thucydides in his masterpiece of Greek political history. So this is a huge, momentous decision. And what all sources record is that they had this democratic process where people came together. This is direct democracy. They made speeches. They talked about it. They thought about it. Everyone got to stand up and try to convince the crowd, tried to convince the citizens of Athens whether it were a good idea or a bad idea for Athens to start this war with Sparta. Now, they did start the war, and the war was kind of a disaster, long story short. But imagine if you were one of the participants in that debate, where you really lived in a direct democracy, where you personally had the chance to stand up in parliament. In Greece, it wasn't a parliament, but it was the Pnyx, it was the place where these discussions took place, that you yourself had the opportunity to stand up in parliament and make your case, make your speech for why everyone else assembled there should agree with you and vote the same way you did. As soon as that process is over, imagine how dishonorable and really evil it would be for you to say, well, I didn't win in this debate. I didn't convince enough of you to vote the same way I wanted to vote. So now I'm going to engage in civil disobedience. Now I'm going to be a sore loser. I'm going to subvert the whole process of democracy. I'm going to even bring this society to a standstill. I'm going to shut down the harbor, shut down the airport. I'm going to sabotage the military, sabotage the army, engage in all these forms of civil disobedience that today are celebrated as if they're heroic within Western democracies because I didn't win. All right. It's self-evidently absurd and it's self-evidently evil in the context of the discussions we have preserved from ancient Athens for someone to even propose this kind of civil disobedience. Right? So the genealogy of civil disobedience, the emergence of this ideal as being something, frankly, better than democracy in many people's minds, it only becomes thinkable. It only becomes possible to imagine this as a moral cause when direct democracy has degraded into a form of indirect democracy, a form of democracy that is so indirect that your country is starting wars and you feel, hey, I never had a chance to speak in Parliament. I never had a chance to have my voice heard. I never got to vote on this. There never was a referendum. I was never consulted. I never voted. You're going to war with my money, my tax dollars, and possibly my son and my grandson. These people are going off to war. You're going to kill people with my flag and my name. I and my descendants are going to bear the consequence of the decision. And I wasn't a part of this decision at all. I didn't get to speak. I wasn't heard. Maybe there was no vote at all. Where the name of democracy still exists, but to some extent, in reality, you live in an oligarchy, you live in an aristocracy, you live in some kind of mixed form of dictatorship. And then you are reduced to opposing that dictatorship through civil disobedience. So in this way, starting with Henry David Thoreau, then with Mohandas Gandhi in India. Also, there was a Russian school of civil disobedience prior to communism under the Tsar. Tolstoy, the theoretician of nonviolence and civil disobedience. So. Okay, now we have a mise en valeur. Now we have a view of civil disobedience that lionizes it, that presents it as something heroic. But even then, it's only heroic when it fails. It's only heroic when it ends in tragedy. It's never heroic when it succeeds. Because when it succeeds, you're still fundamentally talking about a situation in which 5% of the population, quite likely to be religious fanatics, force their opinion on the other 95% of the population. If you want to see really influential examples of civil disobedience, take a look at Israel. Do you think Israel should be ruled by the sober judgment of 100% of the population participating in a democracy, where they have to stand up and make rational arguments what they believe in and consider the law and the Constitution, and then people get to vote and all this stuff? Do you think it should be a procedural, rational democracy involving everyone? Or do you think that a small minority of religious fanatics should just be able to go and engage in civil disobedience? Have you heard of the settlers in Israel? That's one of the most successful examples of civil disobedience in the world. Let me tell you something. Settler is a very strange euphemism for what they've done in the last 40 years, something like that. Yes, a highly motivated, especially religiously defined, fanatical minority can push around the whole of society, can lead that society into wars, and can prevent that society from fighting a war. Israel must be one of the most disturbing examples in the world. But people want to use this term selectively so that you're only talking about civil disobedience when you're talking about people in India resisting the British Empire, and they don't want to talk about civil disobedience. They don't want to use this term when you're talking about Zionist, Jewish fundamentalists, extremely religious people in Israel going out and basically stealing land in the West Bank. It's illegal what they're doing, even under the law of Israel, let alone under the law of the West Bank, Palestinian Transitional Authority, and this kind of stuff. That is civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is rule of your society by the most militant minority. In Israel, who do you think that is? In Afghanistan, who do you think that is? I'm not going to claim to you that 55% of the population are always right and that the minority is always wrong. I would never make that claim. That's preposterous. Sometimes the majority in society is going to be wrong. But the process of making that decision, whereby the evidence is presented, the facts are weighed, speeches are made, there are rational arguments and counter-arguments, and then we vote. Okay, so are we going to have vaccines for everyone? There's a scientific case, there's a moral case, there probably are economic considerations. Okay, we've made this decision. 65% of us have decided that 100% of us should be vaccinated. The moral opposition of just 5% can bring the whole of society to its knees if you believe in civil disobedience. And I don't.